She boarded as a scientist, but landed as a target. When Dr. Celeste Harrington took her first-class seat, she had no idea she was walking into a trap, one designed to erase her career, her reputation, and even her research. But they underestimated her, because Celeste wasn't just fighting for herself, she was about to expose a billion-dollar empire built on stolen innovation and silence. And when the truth finally came out, the entire industry would never be the same. Stay with us because this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Celeste Harrington adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag as she walked through the bustling terminal of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and jet fuel, a familiar mix that reminded her she was on the move again. After a long week at the Advanced Aeronautics Summit, she was eager to board her flight back to New York and return to her research. She reached the Aerovia Airways check-in counter, handing over her passport and ticket to the attendant. The young woman behind the desk scanned the screen, her expression shifting from routine professionalism to subtle surprise. "Oh," she said, blinking. "You're in first class?" Celeste kept her face neutral. It wasn't the first time she had received that reaction. She had spent years proving herself in a field dominated by men who didn't expect a woman, let alone a black woman, to be leading groundbreaking research. "Yes," Celeste said smoothly. "Is there a problem?" The attendant hesitated before shaking her head. "Not at all. You're all set." As she made her way through security, she reflected on how exhausting it was to navigate these silent but persistent barriers. She had earned her seat in first class, just as she had earned her place in the world of aerospace technology. But no matter how high she climbed, there were always people who seemed surprised she had made it at all. With her boarding pass in hand, she stepped into Aerovia Sky Lounge, the airline's exclusive waiting area. The lounge was a quiet oasis, far from the chaos of the main terminal. Plush leather chairs lined the room, and a few well-dressed passengers murmured over their drinks. Celeste settled into a chair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her laptop open on the small table in front of her. As she typed an email, a voice cut through the hum of conversation. "Well, this is unexpected." She looked up to find Graham Whitmore, a familiar face in the world of finance. He was the type of man who thrived on power, a hedge fund manager who had invested in aerospace companies not because he understood the science, but because he knew where the money was. Graham took a slow sip of his whiskey, eyeing her with the kind of amusement that made her stomach tighten. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, lowering his glass. "First class, huh?" Celeste met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "The airline didn't check with you before selling me a ticket, did they?" Graham chuckled. "No, I suppose they didn't. But it's funny, isn't it? Who gets to sit up front and who doesn't?" She knew what he was implying, and she refused to take the bait. Instead, she glanced back at her laptop. "I'm sure you'll have plenty of time to ponder that on the flight." Before he could reply, an email notification popped onto her screen. She clicked it open, her stomach dropping at the subject line. "Urgent. Project review on hold frowning." She scanned the message. The Aerovia Research Committee was unexpectedly delaying the next phase of funding for her project. The language was careful, but she knew what it meant. Someone was pulling strings behind the scenes. Celeste clenched her jaw. This wasn't just a minor delay. Her research was focused on airborne pathogen filtration systems, a project that could revolutionize passenger safety in high-altitude travel. If the funding stalled, it wouldn't just set her back. It would bury years of work. Across the room, Graham smirked over the rim of his glass, as if he already knew. Celeste closed her laptop, inhaling slowly. Whatever was happening, she wasn't about to let it slide. The first-class cabin of Aerovia Airways Flight 227 was as refined as expected. Soft lighting, mahogany trim, and the faint scent of fresh espresso. Celeste adjusted her seat, mentally preparing for the long flight ahead. Before she had a chance to settle in, a flight attendant appeared at her side. "Miss Harrington," the woman said with a carefully composed expression, "may I see your boarding pass again?" Celeste arched a brow. "I already scanned it at the gate." The flight attendant, Marissa Langley, gave a tight-lipped smile. "I understand. We've had a small technical issue with the manifest. It's just a routine check. Celeste handed over her phone, watching as Marissa's fingers tightened around it. After a long moment, the attendant nodded, returning the device. Everything looks fine, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Celeste didn't miss the way Graham Whitmore smirked from seat 2A, watching the exchange like it was a private performance. As the plane taxied down the runway, an older woman across the aisle leaned in. "I've seen this before," the woman murmured. "Don't let them push you around." Celeste turned to her, surprised. "Excuse me?" The woman gave her a knowing look. "I've been flying first class for years. I know when someone's being tested." Celeste absorbed that, her grip tightening on the armrest. Moments later, Marissa returned, this time with another flight attendant at her side. "Miss Harrington," she said, her tone clipped, "we have an issue with your seat assignment." Celeste exhaled sharply. "An issue? You just checked my ticket." Marissa maintained her neutral expression. "It appears your seat was double booked. We'll need to relocate you while we resolve the matter." Celeste tilted her head. "By relocate, you mean move me to economy, don't you?" Graham let out a low chuckle, clearly enjoying the moment. Before Celeste could reply, the older woman across the aisle sat up straighter. "This is absurd," she said, her voice firm. "Why is she the only one being asked to move? Why wasn't this addressed before takeoff?" Marissa's smile thinned. "Mrs. Dawson, please stay out of this." Celeste inhaled slowly. She had two choices: comply or stand her ground. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I need to make a call," she said, her voice even. Marissa crossed her arms. "There's no service at this altitude." Celeste turned the screen around, displaying her credentials as a key researcher for Aerovia Airways. Marissa's expression faltered. The other flight attendant's face went pale. Even Graham's smirk twitched slightly. Celeste's voice remained calm but sharp as a blade. "Would you like to explain to me again how my seat was mistakenly double-booked?" The cabin intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have identified a passenger whose behavior has raised concerns. As a precaution, we are conducting an internal security review." Celeste's pulse spiked. They were setting her up. A shadow fell over her. An air marshal had arrived. Marissa smiled, this time without pretense. "Miss Harrington," she said, voice full of artificial sympathy, "we need you to come with us." Celeste's stomach twisted. She wasn't about to let this happen. Celeste remained seated, her fingers tightening around the armrest as she looked up at the air marshal standing over her. His badge gleamed under the cabin lights, his posture rigid. He wasn't here for a routine check. This was orchestrated. The cabin had gone quiet. Passengers were watching, whispering, some shifting in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing a legitimate security issue or something more insidious. The air marshal, a tall, square-jawed man with a name tag reading Brian Cutter, spoke evenly. "Miss Harrington, I need you to come with me for a security evaluation." Celeste glanced at Marissa Langley, who stood beside him, arms folded, her expression carefully neutral. But Celeste caught the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Her gut twisted. This wasn't just about moving her seat. They were trying to force her off this plane. Celeste took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Security evaluation," she repeated, her voice calm but edged with steel. "On what grounds?" Cutter didn't flinch. "That's classified, ma'am." Graham Whitmore shifted in his seat, still watching with amusement, like this was some kind of high-stakes performance. Celeste leaned back slightly, keeping her voice even. "So let me get this straight. I passed TSA screening, I boarded with a valid first-class ticket, I complied with every request, yet suddenly I'm flagged as a security risk at 38,000 feet?" Cutter's jaw tightened. He wasn't expecting pushback. "This isn't a discussion," he said, lowering his voice. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Celeste exhaled slowly, weighing her options. She knew better than to escalate things physically. Too many headlines had already been written about disruptive passengers who ended up on no-fly lists simply for asking the wrong questions. She needed a different approach. Without breaking eye contact, she tilted her phone slightly, ensuring the screen faced Cutter. "You might want to reconsider," she said, voice calm, "because the second you lay a hand on me, this goes public." Cutter blinked. Displayed on her phone was a recording in progress notification, and not just a regular recording. It was streaming live to a private network, automatically backing up to multiple sources. The tension in Cutter's stance shifted. Celeste didn't wait for him to recover. She turned to the rest of the first-class cabin, raising her voice just enough to be heard. "You're all seeing this, right?" she said. "An airline that claims to value its premium customers is attempting to forcibly remove one of their own, without justification, without cause." A murmur spread through the cabin. People who had been quietly watching started speaking up. "She's right," said Evelyn Dawson, the older woman who had defended Celeste earlier. "This doesn't seem right at all." A man in a suit 2 rows back spoke up. "If there was a real security issue, wouldn't they have handled it before takeoff?" More heads nodded. Several passengers pulled out their phones, ready to record. Marissa Langley's expression hardened. She hadn't expected Celeste to turn the crowd against her. Celeste turned back to Cutter, voice steady. "I think you should check with your superiors before making a mistake that's going to be very expensive for this airline." For the first time, hesitation flickered across his face. The power dynamic had shifted. Cutter's radio crackled. He turned slightly, muttering something into his earpiece. His shoulders tensed as he listened to the response. Celeste didn't know what they were saying, but she saw the moment the decision was made. Cutter exhaled sharply, then straightened. "You're staying in your seat," he said flatly. Marissa's lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth, but Cutter shot her a look. Whatever she had planned, it was over. Celeste didn't smile. She simply leaned back in her seat, smoothing the lapels of her blazer. Marissa turned sharply on her heel and stormed toward the cockpit. The tension in the cabin lingered, but Celeste could feel it shifting. She had won this round, but she wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Something bigger was at play, and she intended to find out exactly what it was. The rest of the flight continued without further incident, but Celeste remained on edge. She knew Marissa wasn't going to let this go. Sure enough, as soon as the seatbelt sign dinged off upon landing, a flight attendant discreetly handed her a note before hurrying away. Celeste unfolded the paper. Neat, precise handwriting. No signature. "Watch your back. This was only a test." A chill ran down her spine. She looked around, scanning the faces in first class. Who had sent it? Was it a warning? A threat? Her pulse quickened. She didn't have time to dwell on it. As soon as she stepped off the plane into the terminal, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A calm male voice greeted her. "Dr. Harrington," he said smoothly. "I trust your flight was eventful." Celeste stopped walking. "Who is this?" "I think you already know," the voice continued. "And I think you also know that pushing back against the wrong people can have consequences." Her grip on the phone tightened. "Is that a threat?" "A reality," the man corrected. "You've been given a lot of opportunities, Dr. Harrington. You might want to consider appreciating them." Celeste's breath slowed. Whoever this was, he wasn't just some lackey. He was connected, and he was making it clear that her presence in first class, in the industry, in positions of power was a problem for them. She forced steel into her voice. "If this is about my research, you're wasting your time. I'm not stopping." A chuckle. "That's what we're afraid of." The call ended. Celeste stood there for a long moment, heart pounding. The airport crowd moving around her. They were watching her. They were trying to control her. She had fought too hard for her place in this world to be pushed aside now. Slowly, she tucked her phone away, squared her shoulders, and started walking. She didn't know who they were, but they had just made a mistake. They had chosen the wrong woman to intimidate. Celeste walked through the terminal, her suitcase rolling smoothly behind her, but her mind wasn't in Seattle anymore. Whoever was behind that call wasn't bluffing. They had power, access, and most importantly, an agenda. She needed answers. As she exited the security checkpoint, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Eleanor Brooks. Eleanor was a former civil rights attorney turned corporate ethics investigator, sharp as a scalpel and just as precise. She had been following Celeste's work for years, advocating for diversity and scientific leadership. Celeste answered without breaking stride. "I saw the footage," Eleanor said without preamble. "The live stream from the plane." Celeste exhaled sharply. "That was fast." "I'm fast," Eleanor replied, "and so are they." The second you push back, they activated a response. The question is, do you want to play defense or offense? Celeste knew what she was asking. If she let this go, whoever was pulling the strings would make her life impossible. Her project would disappear under layers of bureaucracy, her name would quietly be erased from the industry, and if she fought too hard, they'd find a way to discredit her completely. But if she pushed forward, she had a shot at exposing something much bigger than just an accidental seat reassignment. I don't play defense, Celeste said. Eleanor chuckled. Good answer. Meet me in an hour. There's something you need to see. Celeste arrived at a quiet cafe in downtown Seattle, a place far enough from the corporate buildings to avoid running into the wrong people. Eleanor was already there, laptop open, coffee untouched. Celeste slid into the seat across from her. Talk to me. Eleanor turned the screen toward her. 2 days ago, your project review was put on hold. That alone was suspicious, considering how well your last round of testing went. Celeste nodded, scanning the emails Eleanor had pulled up. They claimed they needed additional safety assessments. Standard corporate delay tactic. Eleanor tapped her keyboard, pulling up another screen. Except that same day, Morrison Aerospace, she paused, meeting Celeste's gaze, filed a patent for a filtration system eerily similar to yours. Celeste's stomach dropped. That's impossible, she said. Is it? Eleanor asked. Because the timing is too clean. First, they stall your funding. Then, they try to push you off the plane, make you look difficult, maybe even aggressive. And if that fails, she tapped the screen again, they make you irrelevant. Celeste sat back, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. This wasn't just about blocking her research. They were stealing it. Eleanor continued, whoever called you earlier, that wasn't just a scare tactic. They were warning you to back off because they know you're close to figuring this out. Celeste clenched her jaw. Then they're about to have a problem. She didn't just fight for her place in this industry. She built it, and she wasn't about to let them take it away. The soft hum of the cafe faded into the background as Celeste stared at the screen. Morrison Aerospace had stolen her research. The realization settled in her chest like lead. She should have seen it coming. For years, she had watched corporations edge out independent researchers, buying their ideas outright or drowning them in legal battles until they had no choice but to walk away. But this wasn't just about business. This was personal. She took a slow breath, fingers curling around the ceramic coffee cup in front of her. Do we have proof? Eleanor smirked, the kind of sharp grin that signaled she had already anticipated the question. Not yet, but I know where to get it. She turned the laptop back toward herself, pulling up a new file. Meet Daniel Kessler, senior engineer at Morrison. Quiet, keeps his head down, but he's the one who flagged the patent filing as irregular in their internal system. Celeste arched a brow. You have access to their internal system? Eleanor shrugged. A good journalist never reveals her sources. Celeste knew better than to ask further. What do we know about Kessler? Eleanor leaned forward. We know he worked under Morrison's R&D division for the past 7 years. We know he submitted a formal complaint about unethical research practices 6 months ago, which mysteriously disappeared. And we know he just booked a one-way ticket to Toronto. Celeste's stomach tightened. He's running. Looks that way. Eleanor shut the laptop. And if we don't get to him before he leaves, we might lose the only person who can prove they stole your work. Celeste nodded slowly. She had spent her life navigating a system that wasn't built for people like her. She knew when the rules were rigged, and she knew when it was time to stop playing fair. Where is he now? Eleanor checked her watch. According to his last known location? Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Celeste grabbed her coat. Then we better move fast. The drive to the airport was a blur of headlights and tension. Celeste's pulse drummed in her ears, her mind already calculating the worst-case scenarios. If Kessler had booked a one-way flight, that meant he was in a hurry to disappear. That also meant someone might be making sure he never makes it to that plane. Eleanor pulled the car into the departures lane, barely putting it in park before Celeste was out the door. The airport was a mess of travelers, security lines, and last-minute holiday chaos. She scanned the crowd. Where would he be? Eleanor checked her phone. He's got a flight to Toronto in 40 minutes. Gate C18. Celeste didn't waste another second. She moved through the terminal with purpose, dodging slow-moving families and tired business travelers. Then she saw him. Daniel Kessler stood near the gate, a plain black duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His stance was tense, his gaze shifting from left to right like he was expecting trouble. Celeste stepped forward, but someone else reached him first. A man in a navy suit, corporate polished and forgettable in the way powerful men often were, stopped in front of Kessler. Celeste couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw the way Kessler stiffened, how his grip on his bag tightened. She took another step closer, just as the suited man leaned in, whispering something that made Kessler's face go pale. Celeste didn't wait. "Daniel Kessler," she called, loud enough to cut through the airport noise. Both men turned. The suited man's eyes flickered with recognition, and then he moved. In one fluid motion, he reached into his jacket pocket. Celeste's instinct screamed. "Daniel, move!" she shouted. Kessler hesitated, and then everything happened at once. The suited man lunged forward. Kessler yanked his bag back. A security alarm blared somewhere in the terminal. Celeste sprinted toward them, heart pounding, knowing this was her only chance. She didn't know who this man was. She didn't know who he worked for. But she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't here to negotiate. Celeste's pulse pounded in her ears as she closed the distance between her and Daniel Kessler. The suited man had already positioned himself between them, his stance rigid, controlled, too controlled. This wasn't just some corporate lackey trying to intimidate a whistleblower. This was someone trained to handle problems permanently. Kessler took a step back, his eyes darting between Celeste and the stranger. "I don't know who you are," he muttered under his breath. "But you shouldn't be here." Celeste ignored him. "Daniel, you need to come with me, now." The suited man tilted his head slightly, as if sizing her up. Then he reached into his jacket again. Celeste reacted before she had time to think. She lunged forward, grabbing Kessler's arm and pulling him back, just as the man's hand emerged. Not with a weapon, but a slim black envelope. "Mr. Kessler," the man said, his voice smooth, almost bored. "You're making a mistake." Kessler stiffened. Celeste turned to him, lowering her voice. "Daniel, you don't have to take whatever deal they're offering. You know what they did. You know what they stole." Kessler swallowed hard, his fingers twitching against his bag strap. I just want to leave." "That's not an option," Celeste said firmly. "If you get on that plane without talking, this all disappears. The research, the truth, everything." The suited man exhaled slowly, as if disappointed. "I was hoping we wouldn't have to do this the difficult way." Then, with chilling calm, he turned and waved toward security. Celeste's breath caught as she saw two uniformed officers approaching, their expressions unreadable. A setup. "Kessler, move!" she hissed, but he hesitated. Too long. The suited man stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough for only Kessler to hear. "You think running will help you?" he murmured. "You think she can protect you?" He let out a quiet chuckle. "She can't even protect herself." Celeste saw it then. The moment Kessler's resolve cracked, panic flashed across his face, and in an instant, he made the wrong choice. Without another word, he turned and ran, straight toward the boarding gate. The suited man smiled. Celeste's chest tightened. "Daniel, stop!" But it was too late. The officers grabbed Kessler before he reached the jet bridge, one of them pulling out handcuffs. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Kessler's panic turned to full-blown fear. "Wait, no! What is this?" The suited man turned to Celeste, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Harrington," he said coolly, "you should go home." Then he walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the airport as Kessler was dragged in the opposite direction. She had been outmaneuvered. For now, Celeste sat in the dimly lit bar of her hotel, her untouched whiskey catching the glow of the overhead lights. She replayed the scene over and over in her head. Kessler had been so close to talking, but fear had gotten to him first. Eleanor slid into the seat across from her, setting down her phone. "Kessler's in holding. No charges yet, but it won't be long before Morrison's lawyers make something up." Celeste exhaled sharply. "They knew. They were waiting for us." Eleanor nodded. "And they played it perfectly. Kessler was their loose end. Now they'll either force him to sign an NDA or make him disappear in a mess of corporate misconduct claims. Celeste clenched her jaw. She refused to let them win that easily. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. I know that look. You've got a plan. Celeste's grip tightened around her glass. I don't lose, she murmured. Then with quiet certainty, she added, and I'm about to prove it. Celeste didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small hotel desk, eyes scanning through every file, every email, every connection she had to Morrison Aerospace. There had to be a way to break through their armor. The problem wasn't just theft, it was control. Morrison wasn't just trying to steal her research. They were making sure no one would believe she owned it to begin with. If they could bury Kessler under fabricated charges and NDAs, they could do the same to her. She needed to get ahead of them. At 6 a.m. sharp, Eleanor knocked on the door, already holding 2 cups of coffee. Tell me you've got something. Celeste took a long sip before answering. We can't save Kessler from the inside. They've locked him down. Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temples. So what's the move? Celeste pulled up a document on her laptop, one of Morrison's quarterly financial reports. She highlighted a section and turned the screen toward Eleanor. They have government contract, she said. Eleanor frowned. Yeah, so? Celeste's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. You can't commit scientific fraud and still keep your funding. Eleanor's eyes widened. Then her grin matched Celeste's. You're not just going after them in the press, she realized. You're taking them to the feds. Celeste leaned back. I told you, I don't play defense. Celeste and Eleanor moved fast. By mid-afternoon, they were sitting in a law office in downtown Seattle, staring across the table at Nathan Wells, a journalist specializing in corporate corruption. He had broken some of the biggest defense contracting scandals in the past decade. He knew exactly how to handle a case like this. Nathan scanned the files Celeste had brought, letting out a low whistle. If this checks out, Morrison is in deep trouble. Eleanor leaned forward. We need this airtight. No wiggle room for their legal team. Nathan nodded. I'll need more. Internal emails, recorded conversations, anything that proves intent. Celeste hesitated. The one person who had that proof was locked in a corporate straitjacket. Kessler has the missing pieces, she admitted, but we lost him. Nathan tapped a pen against the desk. Not necessarily. He turned his laptop toward them, showing a news headline that had gone live just hours ago. Aerovia scientist detained amid internal investigation. Eleanor cursed under her breath. They're flipping the narrative. They'll make him look like the bad guy. Celeste's jaw tightened. Not if I get to him first. Nathan raised a brow. And how exactly do you plan on doing that? Celeste took a slow breath. I'm going to make sure everyone is watching. She wasn't just going to fight back. She was going to make Morrison regret ever coming after her. Celeste knew exactly how to fight this battle, not in the shadows, but under the brightest light possible. Morrison Aerospace had power, but they relied on silence. She was about to take that away from them. By morning, her strategy was already in motion. Nathan Wells had pulled every favor he could to push the story into national news outlets. Reports flooded the media about a corporate whistleblower being detained under questionable circumstances, and within hours, Kessler's name was trending online. The pressure was working. By noon, Morrison Aerospace released a vague statement claiming that Kessler was involved in an ongoing internal review, but that they had nothing to hide. That was their first mistake, because now everyone was asking questions. Eleanor grinned as she read through the news alerts. They're scrambling. Celeste nodded, but she wasn't done yet. We need someone on the inside, she said. Someone who still has access. Nathan leaned back in his chair. Do you have anyone in mind? Celeste hesitated. There was one person who might help, but it was a risk. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and selected a name she hadn't called in a long time. Then she hit dial. The call connected on the third ring. A familiar voice answered, laced with cautious irritation. Celeste, I was wondering when you'd reach out. Graham Whitmore. She had spent years avoiding favors from men like him, but this time she needed information, and Graham had it. I assume you've been keeping up with the news, Celeste said. A quiet chuckle. Oh, I never miss a good scandal. She ignored the bait. Morrison's about to collapse under its own lies. but I need to get to Kessler before they bury him completely. There was a long pause. Then Graham sighed. Funny thing, Celeste, he said. I was just about to call you. Her grip on the phone tightened. Why? Because Morrison made their second mistake today. Celeste's stomach twisted. And what was the first? Graham chuckled. The first was underestimating you. The second? The second was thinking they could throw me under the bus too. She stilled. What are you saying? Graham's voice lowered, serious now. They tried to cut me out. After everything I did to help them, they suddenly decided I was a liability. Celeste's pulse quickened. Morrison had burned one of their own, and that meant Graham was looking for revenge. I have files, he continued. Emails, meeting recordings, financial reports, everything you need to blow this wide open. Celeste exhaled. And what do you want in return? Graham chuckled again. Oh, nothing much. Just the pleasure of watching them burn. She hesitated. This was dangerous. Graham wasn't doing this out of loyalty. He was a snake who had simply found a new enemy. But he had what she needed. She made her decision. Send me the files, she said. Graham's smirk was practically audible. Already on their way. Celeste hung up, heart pounding. She had just turned Morrison's own corruption against them. And by the time the day was over, the entire world was going to know the truth. Celeste's laptop screen lit up with dozens of encrypted files, each one labeled with dates, names, and project codes that she recognized instantly. It was all there. Proof of Morrison Aerospace's systematic fraud, stolen research, and illegal corporate maneuvers. She clicked on a recorded meeting transcript from 6 months ago. A familiar voice, William Bradford, CEO of Morrison Aerospace, spoke with casual arrogance. We can't let her keep control of this project. If that means delaying funding, rerouting patents, or making her life difficult, so be it. She doesn't belong in this industry, and we both know it. Celeste inhaled sharply. There it was. Undeniable proof. She turned to Eleanor, who had been reading over her shoulder. The journalist's expression was a mix of shock and exhilaration. This is it, Eleanor whispered. This is how we bring them down. Celeste's phone vibrated. Nathan Wells. She put him on speaker. I hope you're ready for a storm, Nathan said, because I just leaked the first set of documents to the press. Eleanor grinned. And? Nathan laughed dryly. And Morrison is already bleeding. Stock is tanking, board members are panicking, and Bradford just announced an emergency press conference. Celeste leaned back, exhaling. She had them. She wasn't just exposing a company. She was dismantling an empire. By midnight, Morrison Aerospace had officially entered freefall. Bradford's press conference was a disaster. He tried to downplay the scandal, but reporters bombarded him with direct quotes from the leaked files. Within an hour, the company's legal team resigned. By morning, the U.S. Department of Justice announced a formal investigation. And by the end of the week, William Bradford was forced to resign. Celeste watched it all unfold from her office in New York, sipping coffee as the news anchors recapped every scandalous detail. A message popped up on her phone, a simple text from Graham Whitmore. Told you it would be fun. She didn't reply, because this wasn't just about revenge. This was about making sure no one ever tried to steal another scientist's work again. As the media frenzy continued, Celeste received an unexpected call. A high-ranking official from the National Science and Ethics Committee. Dr. Harrington, the voice on the line said, we'd like to discuss a leadership position for you. We need someone to ensure that what happened with Morrison never happens again. Celeste closed her eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. She had fought for her place in this industry. Now she was going to change it. When she finally answered, her voice was steady. I'm listening. The world had tried to push her aside. Instead, she had rewritten the rules. And she was just getting started. Power doesn't belong to those who take. It belongs to those who refuse to be silenced. Celeste Harrington didn't just fight for her research. She fought for every voice that had ever been ignored, every idea stolen, and every person told they didn't belong. And in the end, she didn't just reclaim what was hers. She rewrote the rules for an entire industry. But here's the question. How many more stories like this go unheard? How often does power decide who gets to succeed and who gets erased? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories of resilience, justice, and the fight for what's right, make sure to subscribe. There's always another battle and another victory waiting to be told.